I don't want my husband to attend his ex-wife's funeral. Am I the asshole? I'll be straight with you from the get-go. There's been a shadow hanging over my marriage for as long as I can remember, and it goes by the name of my husband's ex-wife. Right off the bat, I have to admit, I was biased. I just couldn't stand her. In my mind, she was always his ex, that woman from his past who I felt was intruding on our present. But to my husband, she was simply his friend, a title that grated on me every single time I heard it. We're all in our early 40s, supposedly at a stage in life where we've got a bit of wisdom under our belts. Well, that all came crashing down when she passed away recently. An aneurysm, out of the blue, and it sent shockwaves through our lives. I've been with my husband for a decade now. 10 years of building a life together, sharing joys and sorrows, but always with her in the background. He, on the other hand, had known her for over 20 years. Can you imagine that? A whole chunk of his life intertwined with hers. It all started back in college. They were young, full of dreams and naivete. They met in a lecture hall, bonding over a shared love for some obscure indie band. From there, a friendship blossomed. They'd study together in the library, grabbing coffee between classes to fuel their late-night cramming sessions. Before long, they decided to take a leap and got married. It seemed like the natural progression at the time, but as fate would have it, they soon realized they weren't the best match as a couple. The pressures of adulthood, career choices, and just growing as individuals led them to see that they worked better as friends. All of this happened long before I even crossed his path. And from the very beginning of our relationship, he made it crystal clear that she was important to him. A couple of months into our dating days, the truth hit me like a ton of bricks. His so-called friend was, in fact, his ex-wife. I remember the moment vividly. We were sitting in a coffee shop, and he casually dropped the bombshell. He then went to explain their whole history, emphasizing that it was now a purely platonic connection. He told me how they'd supported each other through breakups with other people, how they still shared a passion for those geeky movies that I could never quite get into. I could feel my stomach churn as I expressed my discomfort at him being so close to an ex. And his response? It was like a dagger to my heart. That's fine. If you have a serious issue with it, let me know now and save us some time. I'll choose her. I like you and all, but I've known her for over 12 years, and she's one of the most important people in my life. You'll have to be okay with that if you want us to be a thing. I was dumbfounded. Here I was falling head over heels for this man, and he was basically giving me an ultimatum. But the thought of losing him was unbearable, so I swallowed my pride and grudgingly agreed. Little did I know, this was just the start of a long and painful journey. In the early days of our relationship, whenever we'd make plans, it seemed like she was always in the mix. There were weekends when he'd cancel on me at the last minute because she needed help moving or had an extra ticket to some event. I tried to be understanding, but it stung. And when we did all get together, I'd have to plaster on a smile and pretend that I was okay with it all. She had this way of making me feel like an outsider, even though I was the one he was dating. One time, we were at a barbecue with a bunch of friends. She was there, laughing and chatting with everyone. I watched as my husband joined in their conversation, his eyes lighting up in a way they sometimes didn't when he was just with me. I felt a pang of jealousy, but I pushed it down. I didn't want to cause a scene. But that night, after we got home, I couldn't help but bring it up. He just shrugged it off, saying it was nothing and that I was overreacting. As the years passed, I got used to her presence, but the resentment never really went away. It was always there, simmering beneath the surface. I tried to tell myself that it was okay, that he loved me and we had a good life together. But every time he'd mention going to lunch with her or meeting up for a game night, that old feeling would come back. As our relationship progressed and we got engaged, I thought things might change. I hoped that with the commitment of marriage on the horizon, he'd start to prioritize me over his ex. So, one evening, as we were cuddled up on the couch, looking at wedding magazines and discussing our future, I decided to bring it up again. I turned to him, trying to keep my voice steady, and asked, "What about your friendship with ex-wife's name? Now that we're getting married, won't things be different?" He looked at me with a perplexed expression, as if I just asked him the most absurd question. "Why would us getting married affect my friendships?" he replied, his tone a bit dismissive. I was crushed. It was like he didn't understand how much it bothered me, how it felt like she was always going to be a third wheel in our relationship. But I didn't want to rock the boat too much. After all, we were about to get married. So, I sucked it up and went along, burying my feelings deep down. In the years that followed our marriage, I had to endure countless outings and gatherings where she was present. They'd have lunch dates at least once a month, always going to that little diner they loved since college. I'd picture them sitting there, laughing and reminiscing about old times while I was at home or at work, feeling left out. And then there were the movie nights. They'd go to see the latest sci-fi, or fantasy flick, the kind that made my eyes glaze over, but they were obsessed with. Sometimes her husband would tag along, and it was supposed to make it all seem more innocent, but it didn't to me. Whenever I tried to voice my concerns, he'd shut me down. "We had this conversation before. You had your chance to back out," he'd say coldly. It was like he was using my earlier agreement against me, and I felt trapped. Then, the unthinkable happened. She died. It was so sudden. One day, they'd had lunch together, and on the way back to her car, she collapsed. An aneurysm, they said. My husband was devastated. I saw him cry like I'd never seen before. And while part of me felt bad for his pain, I have to admit, a small part of me was relieved. I thought that finally, this chapter of our lives could close. That we could move forward without her constant presence looming over us. But it was far from over. He immediately got involved in the funeral planning with her husband. I watched him pour his heart into making sure every detail was perfect, as if she was his only concern. When I saw him on the phone with the funeral home for hours, going over flower arrangements and music choices, I couldn't hold it in anymore. One night, as he was getting ready to meet with her husband again to finalize the plans, I confronted him. "You don't think you're going, do you?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. He looked at me as if I'd lost my mind. "Of course I'm going," he said firmly. "She was my friend. Besides you, she was the closest friend in my life." I exploded. "She's dead, so she's not a factor anymore. You don't get to use your 'she's my friend' excuse since she doesn't exist anymore. You had your cry for a couple days. You get to be done with mourning her already. There's no need for you to go to her funeral, since I wouldn't want her at yours." The look on his face was one I'll never forget. It was a mixture of rage and hurt. He was the angriest I'd ever seen him. He held up his wedding band and practically spat his words at me. "I'll be going no matter how you feel, and I'm willing to burn this to the fucking ground if you try to stop me." After that explosive confrontation, the air in our house was so thick with tension you could cut it with a knife. My husband stormed out, slamming the door behind him, and I was left alone, shaking with a mix of rage and regret. I knew I'd crossed a line, but I couldn't take back what I'd said. In my heart, I truly believed I was justified. After all, she was his ex-wife, and now she was gone. Why couldn't he just let go and focus on us? Word spread quickly among our friends and family about what had happened. It started with a few hush phone calls and text messages. Before I knew it, I was being bombarded with accusations. Him, her husband, and even my own sisters were calling me an insensitive asshole. They all seemed to be in unison, saying there was never anything romantic between my husband and his ex, that it was a pure, platonic friendship, and that I was being heartless for trying to stop him from mourning. Her husband, in particular, was brutal. He called me a ghoul for how I'd reacted, as if I was some sort of monster reveling in her death. I was stunned. All these years, I'd kept my feelings bottled up, hiding my resentment because I wanted to keep my marriage intact. Now that she was gone, I thought I could finally be honest, but it seemed like I'd made a huge mistake. I felt completely alone, like everyone had turned against me. The day of the funeral arrived, and my husband went, of course. I watched him get dressed in his black suit, his face solemn and grief-stricken. I didn't say a word as he walked out the door, but inside, I was seething. I couldn't understand why he was so determined to honor her in this way, especially when it was causing so much turmoil between us. When he came back, the silence in the house was deafening. He barely looked at me, and I didn't dare break the ice. Later that evening, I noticed he had a small urn in his hands. She'd been cremated, and he'd been given a portion of her ashes. It was the size of a pill bottle, but to me, it might as well have been a boulder. "That's creepy," I blurted out when I saw it. I couldn't help myself. The idea of him having a piece of her with him forever just seemed wrong. He didn't say a word. Instead, he just flipped me the bird and walked away. It was the final straw. I felt like our relationship was crumbling beneath my feet, and I had no idea how to stop it. In the weeks that followed, life became a living hell. My husband barely talked to me. We slept in the same bed, but it might as well have been miles apart. I'd wake up in the morning to his cold, turn back, and go to sleep at night to the sound of his silent sobs. Everywhere I turned, I was reminded of the mess I'd created. Texts from friends and family continued to pour in, each one more scathing than the last. Someone had even seen my original post on Reddit, where I'd vented about the situation and shared it with everyone they knew. It spread like wildfire, reaching people at my job. I was the talk of the town, and not in a good way. I tried to reach out to my husband, to apologize, to explain myself, but he shut me down at every turn. "It's too late," he'd say. "You said what you said, and you can't take it back." I was desperate. I didn't want to lose him, but I didn't know how to fix what I'd broken. The strain of it all was starting to take a physical toll on me. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Every day felt like a battle just to get through. Work was a nightmare too. I'd make mistakes I never would have before. My mind constantly wandering back to the chaos at home. Colleagues would give me strange looks, and I knew word had gotten around there as well. It was like I was living in a fishbowl, and everyone was watching me drown. One morning, I woke up to find my husband already gone. His side of the bed was cold, and there was a note on the kitchen counter. It was a simple, terse message saying he'd be out late. No love you. No explanation. I crumpled it up and threw it in the trash, tears stinging my eyes. That day, I went through the motions at work, barely functioning. By the time I got home, it was already dark, and his car was still missing. I sat in the empty living room, the silence suffocating. Memories of our better days flashed through my mind. The vacations we'd taken, the lazy Sundays in bed, the way he used to hold me. But now, it all seemed so far away. I felt like a stranger in my own home, like I'd lost not only my husband, but myself in the process. A few days later, I had to go out of town for a work trip. It was a relief in a way, to get away from the constant tension. But as the plane took off, I couldn't help but wonder if things would ever be the same when I got back. The trip was a blur. I gave my presentations mechanically, made small talk with clients with a fake smile plastered on my face. All I could think about was getting home and trying to salvage what was left of my marriage. When I finally returned on Friday, I walked through the front door and was greeted by a house that felt half empty. His car was gone, and there was an eerie stillness in the air. I dropped my bags and walked into the living room, and that's when I saw it, a letter on the coffee table, addressed to me. My hands trembled as I picked it up and opened it. The words inside hit me like a sledgehammer. It was a divorce letter, not a request, not a discussion, but a cold, hard statement that it was going to happen. He'd already filed. He said that my post on Reddit was one of the most hurtful things he'd ever read, that my jealousy of his friendship had driven me to insanity. He wrote, "I fucking watched her die. She was walking by my side when it happened. I have nightmares about it." Reading those words, I felt a pang of guilt. I'd been so wrapped up in my own feelings that I hadn't truly considered the trauma he must have been through. But it was too late. He went on to say that I could keep the house. "I don't want to spend every morning waking up to a reminder of the years of lies that was our marriage," he wrote. There was a list attached of what he was taking. The rest, he said, was mine. His last line was a gut punch. "If it had been me instead of her, she'd have been there for you in an instant. Remember that." I sank to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. How had it come to this? 10 years of marriage, down the drain because of my inability to handle his relationship with his ex. I felt like a failure, like I'd thrown away something precious. In the days following that devastating letter, I was a shell of my former self. I barely left the house, barely ate. The walls of the home we'd built together seemed to close in on me, each room a painful reminder of what I'd lost. I'd wander from one empty space to another, my eyes landing on the photos of us that hung on the walls. Our smiling faces in happier times, oblivious to the storm that would one day rip us apart. I learned from a mutual friend that my husband was staying with her husband. It was like a cruel joke. The two men, bonded by grief over the woman who'd caused so much turmoil in my life, had found solace in each other's company while I was left alone to pick up the pieces. I received a long, scathing text from her husband, telling me to stay away from his home. He said he regretted ever letting me into his life, as if I was the villain in this whole tragic tale. Even my own sister turned against me. In a moment of anger, she told me that if she learned I was dating someone, she'd fill him in on what a black-hearted C-word I am. Those words cut deep. I felt completely isolated, with nowhere to turn. The divorce proceedings were a blur. Lawyers, paperwork, court dates. It all felt so impersonal, so cold. I'd sit in the courtroom, numb, as the details of our life together were dissected and divided. Our assets, our debts, everything we'd worked so hard for was now up for grabs. And through it all, I didn't see my husband. He was represented by his lawyer, his absence a constant ache in my heart. One day, as I was going through a box of old mementos, I found a photo album from our early days. It was filled with pictures of us on our first dates, at concerts, and on weekend getaways. As I flipped through the pages, the tears flowed freely. I realized how much I'd taken our relationship for granted. How, in my jealousy and insecurity, I'd pushed him away. But it was too late. The damage was done. Months passed, and I slowly started to pick up the pieces. I went back to work full-time, throwing myself into my projects. It was a distraction, a way to keep my mind off the emptiness that filled my life. I started going to therapy too. Sitting in that small, quiet room, pouring my heart out to a stranger, was the first step in healing. I talked about my regrets, my mistakes, and the pain of losing my marriage. I also reconnected with some old friends, the ones who hadn't judged me based on that one Reddit post. They were a lifeline, pulling me out of the darkness. We go out for coffee, take walks in the park, and just talk. It was a small comfort, but it was something. As for my husband, I heard snippets of news about him through the grapevine. He was still living with her husband, still mourning. I wondered if he ever thought about me, if he regretted his decision, but I knew I had to let go. Our relationship was over, and I had to find a way to move forward on my own. The house no longer felt like home. I decided to sell it and start fresh somewhere else. Packing up my things, I said goodbye to the memories, both good and bad. As I walked out the door for the last time, I took a deep breath. It was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. I didn't know what the future held, but I was determined to face it, one step at a time.